Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to New Books in Language, a channel on the New Books Network. I'm Malcolm Keating. Today we'll be talking to Herman Cappelen and Josh Dever, authors of Making AI Intelligible, Philosophical Foundations, published in 2021 by Oxford University Press. Welcome to New Books in Language, Herman and Josh.
Thank you.
Hello.
Well, let's dive in. Your book focuses on AI, or artificial intelligence, and how philosophy of language is relevant to understanding and maybe even improving it. So let's start with your book's argument at a high level. What's your book's thesis, first of all, and why did you think it was an important book to write?
So I think rather than give you a thesis, I'd rather give you a puzzle, because I think the thing that motivates our book centrally is a puzzle that we want to address. We've got some suggestions for what to say in response to that puzzle, but a lot of what we want to do is just draw attention to that puzzle and get people talking about it some more. So here's a way of thinking about the puzzle. Increasingly, we're surrounded by various kinds of artificial intelligence computer systems. And these computer systems are meant to answer certain kind of questions for us, make certain kinds of decisions, give us certain kinds of information. And they're doing this by producing some output. They'll dump some text onto a screen. They'll produce a voice through some kind of voice software. And so they're producing things that we'd like to take as telling us something. But we need to make sure we know what these systems are telling us. And one of the things we want to emphasize is it shouldn't be viewed as straightforward what the system is telling you. So here's a kind of motivating example. Suppose you've got an artificial intelligence system whose job is to look at medical records and try to make a diagnosis of a patient. So you might, for example, give it digital images of a certain kind of lesion. And the artificial intelligence was to look at the digital image and do some kind of processing on it and render a verdict. And what we'd like is for the verdict to be that this lesion is a malignant tumor or a benign tumor. So, we take a photo of a lesion on your body and we give it to this computer, and it returns a response saying, outputting the word benign. Now, that looks very reassuring, but of course, it's only genuinely reassuring if when the computer outputs the word benign, what it means is that it's a benign tumor. Right? But it's not a straightforward matter that that's what the computer means. So think about how these artificial intelligence systems are typically developed. The way that something like this is done, is to put it very simplistically, is you train the artificial intelligence system by giving it many, many photos of lesions whose status is known. So you give it a photo of a lesion, it outputs a verdict on whether it's benign or malignant, and then you correct it. You tell it whether it got it right or not. And you do that over and over and over again until you think that it's reached a level of expertise where it can make these decisions properly. But suppose it turns out that there was something going on in the background of the data set that you originally gave it, so that the collection of malignant tumor photos that you gave it all had some distinguishing characteristic to them. There was, for example, some kind of medical instrument in the background of the photo. Or there was something slightly different about the color scheme of the photo. Then there's the danger that what the AI system has done is not trained itself to recognize a malignant or a benign tumor, but rather recognize a photo that has a medical instrument in the background or doesn't have a medical instrument in the background. And so now, when we go out in the wild and we give it this new photo of your lesion, and it reports the word benign, there's this danger that all it's really telling us is there was no medical instrument in the background of the photo of the lesion that we gave it. And of course, that's not a reassuring thing to know. You didn't want to know what stuff was in the background of the photo of the part of your body. You wanted to know whether you're healthy or not. So to know what to make of this AI system's output, you really need to know what it means. And that's now a question in the philosophy of language. We need to think about what makes its outputs mean things. And that's the question we want to try to address.
Mm-hmm. So let's back up a little bit. One of the things we do on this podcast is find out a little bit about the authors themselves. So you're both philosophers of language, but how did you come to be interested in this particular puzzle and in the intersection of artificial intelligence and philosophy of language?
Well, just to pick up and answer that by continuing some of what Josh just said. So I think that the higher level of interest, the more abstract direction from which we come, is the idea that now and as we go forward, we'll be spending more and more of our time communicating with or via various forms of AI. And as we're doing that, it becomes really important to make sure that our meanings or concepts or communicative abilities are somehow aligned so that when I say something to an AI, there's a sense in which it understands it and can convey it further. And when there's an output, that I can understand it and that there's a notion of getting it right. Now, all these mechanisms of trying to understand what understanding is, how meaning is conveyed from one agent to another, how interpretation works, that's what we've been working on as philosophers of language throughout our entire careers. Actually, Josh and I have written, I don't know, what is it, 4 books together before this? And they were all about those issues, about what is it for an agent, and think agent more generally now as including an artificial agent, to be able to produce an output that is meaningful. And what does it mean for that to be meaningful? And then what is it for someone else to understand it and interpret it? And what is it for that exchange to be a successful instance of communication? So those are issues that people in philosophy have worked on basically for the last 100 years or more, since Frege. And it would be incredibly surprising, we thought, if it turns out that everything that philosophers have had to say about this for the last 100 years turned out to be irrelevant in this new setting where we have new kinds of communicative agents and new forms of engaging with creatures that are quite different from us, but in some ways similar, because they're also neural nets. And so we wanted to use some of those frameworks and models and theories and results that have come up over the last 100 years to help understand the human-AI interaction. And then maybe by using those models, we can also, but this would be sort of a long-term goal, think of ways to improve those interactions. So there are points that people worry a great deal about. One of those is we get the kind of outputs from an AI that Josh described, say, in a medical case. But people want to know why. They want reasons for these judgments or claims made. They can have incredible and very, very significant impact on our lives. And so we want to know, we want reasons. So if a doctor tells you you need a certain kind of treatment, first thing you would do is, well, what's wrong with me? What's the reason for that? And then if you got a good doctor, the doctor will give you an explanation and give the reasons, the evidence. Now, as things are right now, we don't get that. But that whole process, the process of getting reasons and explanations, which is a very important part of that communicative exchange, is something that presupposes that there is content, that the kind of thing that it actually says something, and that what it said, the AI said, is something that reasons can be given for. And so there are kind of pressing reasons for thinking very carefully about what constitutes the content of AIs, how it aligns with our content. And our hope was, by thinking through that, using the kind of results that philosophers have come up with, we could also have some practical effects down the line.
So one of the terms you've both been using here is neural network. And I just want to make sure we're clear about what this is referring to. So in your book, you're not concerned with things like calculators, even though those have outputs that are numerical and you might want to talk about as, oh, the calculator said the answer to 2 plus 2 is 4. But you are concerned with things like GPT-3 and other sorts of artificial intelligences. So what is a neural network? What's the criteria for being the kind of AI that you're concerned with in this book?
Good. So I think the characteristic feature of neural nets and the kind of artificial intelligence systems we're thinking of is that there's a sort of computational and algorithmic obscurity to how decisions are being reached. Right? So the contrast on the other side is something like a program that's designed to, say, tell you whether a number is prime. And you can look at the details of the program and see exactly how the program is figuring out whether the number is prime. It's going through a certain collection of computations. It's taking a number, trying to divide it by all the numbers smaller than it. And you can look at that and think, I understand exactly how that algorithmic procedure is yielding an answer specifically to the question, is this number prime? In these kinds of neural network systems, on the other hand, when you look at the final computational process, it is, for humans, obscure why it's answering the question that we're taking it to answer. Right? So you design these systems by setting up just a kind of system of nodes, and then you feed it some kind of input. Say, you want to build a image recognition software. So you're just trying to get something which will distinguish between photographs of birds and photographs of things other than birds. And so you give it a digitized photograph of a bird, and it takes all that digital information and just starts doing some kind of calculation on it. And at the initial stage, it doesn't really matter exactly what the calculation that's done is. It just weights various parts of the numerical data in the imagery in different ways and drops out a verdict, bird or not a bird. And then you give it some feedback. You tell it whether it got that one right. And then based on whether it got it right or not, it goes back and it re-weights various parts of its computational algorithm. So one node in the network gets weighted more heavily and another node gets weighted less heavily. It redoes the calculation, you give it a new verdict, and so on. And eventually it starts to converge on decisions that you like. But even once it's converging on decisions that you like, if you look at the internal processing, all you're going to see is vast numbers of bits of data being run through a bunch of kind of linear algebra and a number dropping out at the end. And if you look at that and ask, well, how is it figuring out that this is a bird? Is there like a part of the program where I can say, this is where it's kind of checking to see how many feathers there are on the object or whether it has a beak? You're not going to find anything like that. It's a kind of overall holistic computational process that doesn't break down into components, at least on the computational level, that we're able to understand. And I think this is what creates the particularly pressing interpretive demand, right? Given that you can't look at the computation and see transparently why it's the kind of computation that would figure out whether something is a bird photograph, we have to worry about whether the output of the program really does mean that it's a bird photograph rather than meaning some other obscure computational feature about the way the bits of the photograph are aligned with one another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it seems like, so as I was reading your book and preparing for this interview, I started to notice how often people talk about these kinds of AIs in terms like you've just described, that it means things, that it says things, and so on. So there was a headline in Vox in September that was talking about GPT-3, characterizes it as a smart and poetic AI, but also that it says terrible things about Muslims. But here's the weird thing. This article doesn't talk to any philosophers of language about the issue. Instead, they talk about, well, let's get some better data sets in order to train these neural nets. So, here's another maybe obvious question that I know you've talked about a little bit, but I just want to hear more on. Why should people in, for instance, the AI community read this book if they're the ones that you're concerned about reading it? Why should they care what two philosophers of language have to say about these issues? Isn't the question really about data sets and algorithms?
Yeah, this is a theme we're trying to push throughout the book. And I think it's definitely one of the larger goals of the book is to try to show that what philosophers have done is of great relevance and importance, both theoretically and practically. And so the maybe easy way to think about this is that the people who make GPT-3 and who work for the big companies that make the technology that we're talking about now, they're trained in making computers and programming them and things like that. They have no training or very little training or understanding of what communication is, what a language is, what the different semantic, pragmatic mechanisms are that generate successful communication. And those are issues that are all, at least the foundation of all of that, is in philosophy. Mm-hmm. And it's strange that we're having these transformative technologies being driven by people who lacks training. When you hear them talk about it, they talk about issues in philosophy, but they are, in effect, amateurs. They might have picked up a little here or there, or they're making it up on their own, but they're amateurs for thinking about the nature of communication, the nature of representation. Those are the things that we philosophers are quite good at. But we're coming very late to the game. We don't have the kind of funding they have. They're making the successful technology. So it's very hard and probably very unlikely that we'll ever get a real voice in sort of directing or having much impact. But at least I think if you're interested in these larger theoretical questions, it's going to be unavoidable to have philosophers involved in it. But I think part of the reason it's not happening is kind of institutional, structural, in some sense, that philosophers are doing their little puzzles that we've been worried about for the last 100 years, and we publish papers on those, and it's kind of a recognizable way to have a career. If you're going to start writing on the sort of thing that Josh and I wrote this book about, where you connect it to a form of technology, there's a tendency, I think, to think that, well, how can we do that if we don't know how to make the machines, if we don't know how to do program, if we don't know all the technical stuff? And we're hoping that reading this book, you can get a sense that there's quite a bit of results that you can come up with and contributions you can make, even if you're not someone who's going to program these systems. I mean, there's something we haven't talked about yet, and it's sort of relevant here, I think. Mm-hmm. And it springs out of what you were saying. We talk about GPT-3 and the sort of systems that Josh was talking about as having told us things, making suggestions, making decisions, responding to inputs. So we're doing all of this in this content type discourse with respect to it. But there is an alternative that is very powerful when you start thinking about it, which is, no, they never say anything. They can't represent the world. They don't have any content. They don't share our language. They can't speak English. They can't understand English. They've never told us anything. They've never made any suggestions. They've never made any decisions. Basically, what they are is a little source of evidence for contents that we then can produce. But the only real content comes from us humans responding to these neural nets, qua evidence in favor of some hypothesis or another, just like the smoke isn't in itself saying that there was fire, but we can say that having looked at it. So we're throughout trying to contrast this contentful view of AI, which, as you were pointing out, is the way we're talking about, the way we react to it. And in the long run, it's very hard to see that we should give all that up. But it is a real option. Now, choosing between these two options, thinking of the AIs as having content versus just being these contentless things that we can use as evidence, that again brings up these completely philosophical issues about how you adjudicate between those two views. And then going back to the issue of why philosophy is relevant, it's really hard to see that people whose training is in how to make full programs should be able to get that right. I mean, they will make conjectures and so on about it, but it's not their area of expertise. So it really is a wonderful area for philosophers to try to start engaging with more extensively. I just want to add one more thing about this.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And one of the also really big issues, I talked earlier about explainable AI as a really pressing topic.
Mm-hmm.
But there's another issue people now worry a great deal about, and it's value alignment between AI and humans. So we want, as these systems get more and more powerful and maybe eventually much smarter than us, people worry that they can turn against us and that they can be used for bad purposes. And then the way this issue is described at a high level of abstraction is, well, we need to make sure that the content, the norms that they have, the AIs have, align with ours. And so this is a really big issue. Now, as soon as you start thinking about that, this issue of content again comes up because it assumes that there are norms and values and things that correspond to our norms and values that can be put, and there's scare quotes here, in the AI.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the question of whether that can be done depends on, well, what are the contents of normative claims? How do you put that in an AI or in a neural net? How do you find that? And so again, this is where, and that's one issue in philosophy of language, and it's also the intersection of philosophy of language and moral philosophy. So it's an area where philosophers can contribute. I think it's still incredibly early days for figuring out how we can do that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's early days for figuring out whether anyone will listen to what we have to say, because the people just making the systems have so many more resources and so on than us. And their goals are not really reflecting on these things. It's more trying to make more powerful systems. But our hope is that at least at some point, these philosophical dimensions will be integrated more closely into the development of those systems.
Yeah. Yeah. And so the first part of the book, the first chapter, you set out the puzzle as you have already. And we'll talk about the particular case as we move on. But in the second chapter, you address some of the worries that we've just discussed. You have this sort of Alfred the skeptic character and answer some of the questions that I've just put to you. One other question that I just want to raise that you talk about in that chapter is it seems like one answer might just be, well, yeah, sure, we talk about GPT-3 saying things, but we don't mean says literally. It's just some sort of figurative or loose talk. Why don't you think that's a satisfactory answer?
Good. So I think the reasons for wanting something more than loose talk are implicit in some of the examples we've been talking about. But look, consider another example. Suppose at some point these sorts of artificial intelligence systems start to play a role, say, in our legal and judicial system. There are already instances somewhat along these lines. And suppose you get to the point where the way trials are held is you feed in a body of evidence to an artificial intelligence system, and then it outputs a verdict, right? And it outputs innocent or guilty. And on the basis of that output, we're now supposed to take important real-world actions, right? We're going to put someone in prison or not put them in prison. And I think if that's going to make sense as a practice, as the way that we're going to run our lives and our society, we need these artificial intelligence systems to actually be telling us things and not for it to just be loose talk, right? So if we're going to tell someone, because this bit of machinery output the word guilty, we're going to put you in prison for 10 years, right? If they ask, how that makes sense, why that bit of text on the screen means they have to go to prison, and we say, well, the computer didn't really say that you were guilty. That's just kind of loose talk. We're just interpreting the text on the screen as, we'll take that as meaning that you're guilty. That doesn't seem reassuring, right? Because now we want to know, but what licenses you in taking it in that way? If the trust that we're supposed to place in these systems is dependent on their accuracy, the very notion of accuracy presupposes the notion of content, right? You can't be accurate unless you're saying something that can be true or false so that you can be reliably true. So if we're not willing to actually commit to these systems saying things and telling us things, then it's very hard to see how it's going to make sense to let them play the kinds of roles in our lives that increasingly we're headed in the direction of having them play.
Yeah, and so what you've just described, I think, connects to the third chapter of your book where you discuss aboutness and representation. So there needs to be something that the AI is in some sense talking about. It has to be representing something. And I'm being super loose here, as you yourselves note that you're going to just use sort of aboutness and representation at a high level interchangeably. So I want to ask you about that third chapter, in particular about meta semantics, because I think for our listeners that might be an interesting topic for you to discuss. That seems to be really crucial for what you're doing in this book, and it may not be familiar to everyone, but also correct me about my characterization of aboutness and representation. Fill in what we need to know in order to appreciate what comes next in the book.
So we're trying to use a very intuitive, non-theoretical notion of aboutness, which is if the system says Malcolm doesn't have cancer, then the system has said something about you. And it's not just anything it has said, it has talked about your situation with respect to cancer, namely you don't have it.
Mm-hmm.
And so what it has done is represented one way that the world is, namely it's a world in which the guy, you, fail to have a certain kind of illness.
It's a good world.
And it's a good world. That's what you want. But that assumes that the system can represent you, cancer, put the two things together and say that you don't have it. I think that idea is very, very intuitive. There are many different philosophical theories about how that's possible, how a system can do that. So I'm sitting on a chair right now, and this chair isn't about anything. It's just there. It's not about me or you or anything. It doesn't have that capacity for representing the world. And this paperclip that I'm now just picking up, it couldn't represent you. So there are these systems in the world that can do this representing the world. And I'm assuming now that when I speak, I can do that. I can talk about Malcolm. I can talk about our podcast. I can talk about Josh. So this is an amazing thing that my mind and my language can do. It can, even though we're spread all over the world right now, language can connect in some way to you, and the listeners will be able to know that I said something about the two of you, and so on. Mm-hmm. And then there are things in the world that it fails, doesn't have that property, like the paperclip and the chair. Now, metasemantics, and the way we're using it, is a theory about what it is that makes it possible for a system to do representing. What are the conditions that must be in place for representation to happen? So you can think of that as the metaphysics of representation. What are the facts in the world that grounds this capacity for representation that is so important to humans and that distinguish us from paperclips and chairs and so on? And so there are many theories about that in philosophy, competing theories. And they all seem, and one of the issues about philosophy that frustrates non-philosophers is we don't have a consensus. It's not like we can say, we spent 100 years thinking about this and we've figured it all out. Here's the correct theory. Philosophy doesn't work like that because what we're doing is so hard. But we have some pretty good candidates. One of the things that we're trying to do in the book is show how some of those candidates that we think are quite plausible can be applied to AI systems. So one option is, that I was talking about earlier, is, look, they just can't do it because they're just not the sort of object that can represent. Now, you should be very suspicious of that because remember how Josh was talking about the nature of neural nets. And one of the things that's worth mentioning there is that your brain is also a neural net. So it would be, they're kind of similar, the natural and the AIs we're talking about, the neural net-based AI. And so what we're trying to see is can we find patterns that are sufficiently similar to the human case in the AI case that can ground representation. So we're trying to say, look, don't give up the thought that they can represent the world, that they can say something. And we can show you how that could be made possible by looking at some of these theoretical frameworks. And we present 3 of those. Mm-hmm. So that's a high-level description of the meta-semantics idea and the kind of sort of simple talk about representation that we rely on throughout.
Great. Thank you. Yeah. So that chapter it's relatively short. You're just giving us the sort of nuts and bolts in order to let us move on. The real, as I take it, the real stuff starts happening in chapter 4, where you present your theory. And here you present what you call a de-anthropocentrized externalism. So let's unpack this. Obviously, de-anthropocentrized, we got to do something with the fact that it's not humans we're talking about here. So that's an issue. But what is externalism? What is externalism in the context of philosophy of language? And why do you think this approach is better than other approaches? Obviously, philosophy of language has lots of different options in the past 100 so years in English philosophy, other philosophies maybe longer. Why externalism?
Good. So I think, if there's a central positive lesson I'd like to try to have absorbed from this book, it's that the externalist tradition is a natural and important place to look for making some progress in thinking about how artificial intelligence systems could be successfully representing stuff about the world. So look, when the question first gets posed, we've got this artificial intelligence system. We're hoping it's a kind of bird image detector, and we're wondering whether it's been successfully created as a bird image detector. I think it's a very natural thought that the way to answer that question is to now dive into the details of the program, like go down into the source code and start looking at how all the computational algorithms are designed and try to work out from that whether this thing is doing bird representations in the end. And I think especially if you're a programmer, this is automatically going to be where you start because this is your area of expertise, right? This is what you do, is go and work with the details of code. And so when you want to try to answer this semantic question about what your program is doing, you want to do what you always do. You want to go inside the thing and look at how it's working on the inside. And what we want to suggest is that there's an important thought that plays a lot of role in philosophy of language, suggesting that this isn't always the right approach for figuring out why things represent the way they do. And thinking about the human case is a helpful way to think about this. So when an ordinary person says, for example, that Brutus killed Caesar, and we want to understand them as saying something about these two historical figures, right? They've said something that's about Brutus and about Caesar, these people, 2,000 years ago in a different part of the world. I want to know, what is it that makes what they've done about those historical figures? Here the suggestion is, look, going and looking inside the head of the speaker may not be the best way to answer that question. And when I say look inside the head of the speaker, we could mean this neurologically. So, one thing you might be tempted to do is go look at the brain structure, look at how the neurons are wired together, and try to extract from that some kind of reason for thinking that this person is thinking about and saying things about Brutus and Caesar. Or you might think about this non-neurologically, but just mentally. You might sort of think about the sorts of mental imagery that they're having or the features that they're considering when they attempt to talk about these people. The thought is all of these things might not provide the right tools for linking up their words and their thoughts with these historical figures. That instead, what you might need to do is think about how these people are situated in their environment. So the reason that this person's utterance, Brutus killed Caesar, is about the two historical Romans could be more to do with the fact that this person has inherited the words Brutus and Caesar from someone else, who in turn inherited the words from someone earlier than that, and back and back and back until you arrive at an early point in Roman history where someone is pointing to these two historical figures and saying, let's name that child Brutus and let's name that child Julius Caesar. And the thing that makes the words of someone speaking now 2,000 years later about these people is the fact that there's this chain of usages leading from them across the world back through time, back to the original people. And if you think those are the facts that make your language or your thoughts about the people that they're about, it's just going to be a mistake to try to probe questions of aboutness by looking at internal computational features. And so if that's how it is with us, maybe that's how it is with these programs as well. And the thing that philosophers have to contribute here can be just suggesting a fundamental reorientation on the question, thinking you shouldn't be looking, or at least looking exclusively at how the program works. You need to be thinking about how this program is situated in its broader causal and cultural environment to be able to figure out what's meant by the program.
Mm-hmm. And just to be clear here, you're not saying that we shouldn't be looking at all about what's happening internally. It seems like something at the biological, the mental level is important, right? But for externalists, that's not the only story. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we want to think of externalism as a kind of opening up thesis. It's a thesis that the stuff that matter can be stuff outside the head as well as stuff inside the head.
Gotcha. Good. So we have this introduction of de-anthropocentrized externalism. So for human beings, we're thinking about causal connections to people like Brutus way back in history. What's going on for AI? What is the externalism happening there?
So we're thinking that it's not just philosophers coming with our theories from the last 40, 50 years to AI and then just straight applying it and seeing if they fit properly. We're thinking that when philosophers were developing these theories, the kind of externalist theory that Josh described, they were thinking just about humans most of the time. Just, like little specific features about how we engage with each other, quite the kind of animals that we are. And a lot of the theories picked up on very distinctive features of just our kind of mammal. But we're suggesting that's a kind of anthropomorphizing move. The sort of thing that externalism really should be more general. It should be something that applies. Just putting aside computers for a moment, but even just think like meeting aliens. That creatures are very different from ourselves that may be able to speak. Their internal structures and so on, their brains, if they have them, could be really different from ours. So we want, and their way of life might be very different. So we want something that is a form of externalism that's not tied too much to the details of our way of life and our type of creature. And so the de-anthropomorphizing thing we're talking about is to say, let's take these theories from the history of philosophy, recognize that they were too anthropomorphic. They were too much focused on specific features of human life, abstract away from that and try to find a form of externalism that can incorporate both humans and computers while preserving the essence of externalism. And as Josh was just saying, one of the things that you are not doing right now and that your listeners are not doing is they're not looking inside our brains or neural nets to understand what we're saying. Mm-hmm. In fact, I don't think any human has ever figured out what another human said or meant by looking inside their brain. So the practice of interpreting comes from something outside of that, outside the brain, and then applied to AI, outside the program. And the externalist traditions that we're playing around with in this book have different views just about what that external element is. And so for each of the theories we consider things from Saul Kripke, from Putnam, Tyler Burge, Gareth Evans, Millikan. And these are all different types of externalist theories. We try to abstract away from the peculiarities of the human and create externalist models that are de-anthropomorphized. And by that we mean something that can apply to AIs as well. So in doing that, we think we can understand better the way in which AIs can represent the world. But we've also done something that's really cool from the point of view of philosophers. We've made the externalist tradition better. We've discovered that it was just too anthropomorphic, too much stuck in little features of our kind of mammal. And then I think we get better philosophy of language, better philosophy of communication by doing this application. So it isn't just like a top-down thing where we philosophers come and we have all the answers and then we figure out how it works with AI. No, it's not like that. They create problems for us. We got to revise our theories, and then the revised theories will be better theories, and they'll hopefully, if they work out, be theories that tell us quite a bit about artificial intelligence and the human AI interaction.
Let's dive into the theories then. So basically the structure of the book, you start to focus on this case that you introduce at the beginning of the book, which is where the statement we're looking at is Lucy is high risk. This is coming out of an AI called Smart Credit, which has sadly turned her down for a mortgage. So you have chapters where, first of all, you focus on how the AI can refer to a property that is being high risk. Then another chapter about how the AI can refer to Lucy. And then, of course, in chapter 7, we have to talk about how it can put these together through predication. Something interesting that you just sort of alluded to there is that you're not just drawing on a particular externalist. You draw on Saul Kripke, Gareth Evans. You draw on teleosemanticists, Karen Neander, David Papineau. So you kind of answered this again. It's great. You're anticipating my questions a bit, but why not just stick with one particular externalist approach? I mean, Evans and Kripke disagree about reference. Why not just pick one and apply it sort of systematically here?
I guess the way I would want to answer this is to say that we view things as just being at a very preliminary stage here. I mean, we think we're at the very beginning of an extremely hard process of trying to figure out how meaningful systems, which are really quite different from us in some important ways and quite similar to us in some important ways, can successfully mean things. And we think we've got these externalist tools that the philosophical tradition has developed for us, and there are a variety of these tools, and they have interesting differences from one another. But we think all of these tools have been, as Herman was just stressing, trained on the case of human meaning and human communication. And, I think, one of our central driving thoughts in this book is that this is an incredibly productive area for cross-communication between philosophers and people working in the artificial intelligence tradition. So we think, we have some things to say which are going to be helpful for them in the kinds of projects that they want to engage in. But we also think that philosophers need to be paying more attention to what the programmers and the people thinking about artificial intelligence are saying. Because we think you can't just take what the philosophers have said about the externalist tradition and cookie cutter apply it to the artificial intelligence systems, right? Because they need to be removed from the particular anthropic context in which they were developed. And so we think it's not the best way to proceed to just grab onto one particular implementation of the externalist tradition and start trying to force the various aspects of artificial intelligence output into that framework, because that framework is going to, from our point of view, be distorted by its anthropocentric origins in particular ways. And the particular kinds of distortion may vary from one externalist framework to another. And so the best, like the most optimistic way to make progress here is to try out a variety of these tools and think, how in each one of these cases are we going to go about confronting the question, in what way has this idea been too heavily trained on the specifics of the kinds of creatures that we are? Right? So if you think about the Kripkean system, which is one of the frameworks that we talk about, one of the ideas that Kripke has for the way in which our names come to be about the specific objects that they are, is that there's a process in which there's a sort of initial dubbing. Right? So there's some object that's maybe directly perceptually presented to us, and we point to that object and we say, let's call that object Brutus. And there's thereby the beginning of a naming tradition. And then that naming tradition gets handed from one person to another. And that happens in a specific way. There's a use of the name by one person. There's a hearing of the name by the other person. That person then picks up that name and uses it themselves. And they have to use it in a very specific way, right? So they have to intend to be continuing the same naming tradition. It's not going to work if someone introduces Brutus to me and says, this is Brutus, or tells me about Brutus, I saw Brutus kill Caesar. And I think, oh, Brutus, that's a nice name. I think I'll use it for my cat. And then I go on and make further uses of the name. Well, those uses aren't going to be involved in the same chain of reference. So you have these ideas about dubbings and chains of reference, where dubbings are centered around the idea of kind of direct presentation of objects, pointing at objects, intentions to name those objects. And chains of reference are based around intentions to participate in the same naming practice. And all of these things threaten to be too specific to the sorts of creatures that we are. And that's why we want to ask these questions, like, could you take these ideas and now ask, what would it be for there to be a dubbing incident for an artificial intelligence system? Because that can't be a matter of the AI system pointing to some object, or even the AI system being perceptually presented with that object. We need some more general picture about what a dubbing would be. And what would it be for the artificial intelligence system to be participating in the ongoing naming practice? That probably isn't a matter of it's having a certain kind of intention, because a lot of these systems don't plausibly have anything like intentions. And so there are these now very specific questions that you're going to have to ask when you deal with the Kripkean framework about how are you going to abstract away from these human-specific ideas. Right? But those questions are specific to the Kripkean way of putting things. When you turn to a sort of Tyler Burge-style externalism, there are going to be a different collection of questions that you have to confront when you think about how to de-anthropocentrize that. And so we thought by looking at a variety of these traditions, we're going to get a better overall sense of the ways in which the externalist tools that we'd like to hand over to the programming community as a useful tool have been overly influenced by the philosopher's specific engagements with humans as the target.
Mm-hmm. So let's stick with the Kripkean approach, because that's the subject of your chapter 5. How does it work for something like the predicate high risk when this AI is trying to say of Lucy that she is high risk? What's the dubbing? What's the causal chain for an AI?
So one of the, I guess, characteristic features of the discussions in all these chapters is we don't have a unique, we give you several options for how to think about it, and we're not sure which one is the correct one. And I'll get back to that in a little second, how to think about how to make that choice. So in the Kripke model, it's quite simple. One of the weird things about Kripke's book, it's a series of lectures, Naming a Necessity, is that the positive theory is presented, I think, in just a page or even a paragraph or something, where Kripke says, in the case of a human, there is an original dubbing, there's a passing along with some kind of intentions along the way, and then reference, the ability to talk about an object, happens by virtue of being a part of this historical chain. And so you can imagine someone introducing the term water or gold a long time ago, pointing out some substance, and it's being passed along throughout history, linguistic history, and you and I are now part of that chain. We denote those substances and we can predicate being wet or being water or being gold by virtue of being part of that historical linkage. And so that's the externalist element, is that it's historical. It's not something you can see inside the head. And so the first step towards generalization towards AI is to say, well, this looks great for AIs because it's part of a chain. It is part of a chain. We introduced this term a long time ago. If the model is correct for humans, then we do our denotation of those properties by being part of the chain. And then look what we did. We made this new thing. It's got a neural net just like us. It's made from different stuff, but who cares? And then we have these people who are programmers who will, and this is where the tricky part comes in, make it part of the same chain as we are. Now, of course, the making part of the same chain as we are will be different in this particular case from what it was for humans. And so now we have to think through different options for how to think about being made part of a chain. And this is where we give the readers some options for how to think about it. But and this now we get very, maybe too philosophical for people who are not that into philosophy. But one of the points we try to make throughout is that now we need a higher level of abstraction for thinking about how to make these choices. In other words, how to think about the right way to do the abstraction. So I was describing the sort of baby picture of a Kripke applied to AI. Got to make these choices about how the programmer makes it part of the chain. How do we make those choices? They shouldn't be just random. They shouldn't, but how are they made? And this is where we try to introduce a higher level. Before we were talking about meta-semantics, but you can imagine an even higher level, the meta-semantics, which guides you in thinking about meta-semantics. And so we introduced some principles that we take from the philosopher Timothy Williamson for how to think about how to make choice points on the meta-semantic level. In other words, how to implement this Kripke picture, for example, for predicates. And so I think the structurally interesting thing about the book is this even higher level that gives you guidance for how to think about the meta-semantic level, which then gives you guidance for how to think about the particular choice points. Mm-hmm. So that's the structure of how we do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we don't have time, I don't think, to get into all the nitty-gritty details, but let's do at least talk about the question of proper names, because in your example, you have Lucy, who is high risk, and you point out that some AI like smart credit may not have been trained on data sets that even include some lexical item, Lucy. So you take an approach that you call the mental file theory to try and explain this, how it is that smart credit can still refer to Lucy, even though her name is nowhere in its neural network. So what's the mental file situation or theory in human beings? And then how do you abstract to get this to work for AI?
Good. So here's the basic mental file picture. The mental file theorist thinks that as you encounter objects in the world, you, as we're metaphorically, open up a mental file. And exactly what this amounts to, there are going to be different ways of understanding this, but the basic idea is there's some kind of standing cognitive structure in which you collect a bunch of information that you take to be about a single person, right? So you encounter someone, you see something about them, they're wearing a red shirt, they're talking loudly, and you sort of write down a bunch of properties in your head. There is someone, they're wearing a red shirt, they're talking loudly, and so on. Later, you encounter an individual again, and you take them to be the same person that you encountered before. And so new information that you get about them, you stick in the same file. You sort of cluster all that information together. And now we can now ask about this mental file, well, who is it a file about? And this is the kind of question that's going to get especially pressing when you get confused. So, for example, there's a pair of identical twins, and sometimes you're encountering one of them and sometimes you're encountering another. But you fail to realize this, so you just start putting all of the information into the same file on the assumption that there's a single person that all this information is about. Now, if this confusion gets bad enough, you might end up wanting to say, this file doesn't successfully pick out anyone. But if there's just a little bit of confusion, if occasionally you input information from the wrong person into a file, you might still want to hold on to the thought that this file is successfully picking someone out. Mm-hmm. Right? But now we need to know who is it picking out and why is it picking out that person? And one of the pictures that motivates the mental files framework is that the file is about the person that would be knowledge maximizing. Mm-hmm. So what it is that makes your file a file about Brutus rather than about someone else is that by taking this to be a file about Brutus, so that your beliefs involving that file we interpret as Brutus beliefs, by taking it in that way, we're going to maximize the amount of stuff that you know. We'll be able to say now, oh, this person does know that Brutus killed Caesar and that Brutus played certain roles in Roman history, had certain practices and so on. Whereas if we took the file to be about someone else, we might, as it were, coincidentally get some of the things right, but you wouldn't count as knowing these things because you didn't have the right kind of evidence, you didn't have the right kind of epistemic relations. So the thought is, to figure out who your mental files are about, you need to think about how your mental life is epistemically connected to your environment, which objects you're actually getting evidence about and are in a position to know about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so for AI then, how does it have some kind of epistemically rewarding relationship, as you put it, to the outside world? How do you cash this out for AI?
Well, so this gets a little bit back to the issues we were talking about earlier, the guiding meta semantics. And the principle that I was just mentioning, that we took it from Timothy Williamson, but I didn't say what it was, but so the basic principle is something that's knowledge maximizing for us. Mm-hmm. So we're thinking that we've created these systems. The content attributions are made by us, and we've created them in order to help us improve our understanding of the world, like who has cancer, who has creditworthiness, who should be in prison. So we want this to be knowledge that helps us. So the choice points, the thing that should weigh evidence or sources of evidence, as the mental file framework talks about, it should be done in such a way that it maximizes the potential for human interpreters' knowledge. Now you could see that's quite a biased. You could do it the other way around and think, well, no, really, it should be the system itself that gets the knowledge, the most out of it. So here we're choosing to sort of see them as tools for humans, and then that choice guides us in talking about how to weigh the relevant kinds of evidential sources for the system. Now, just in detail how to do that, but I don't think we even try. We give a general principle for how to do it. So this is the point where clearly more detail is needed, but the general principle is pick a way of weighing sources of information. Gareth Evans talked about the dominant source of information. Develop a notion of dominance that is such that by using it, it maximizes the knowledge we get from the systems. Mm-hmm. And so if you're looking for very detailed stories about how to do particular systems and their interpretation, you don't get obviously very much from this book. What you get are these general frameworks for how to do it in a particular case, and then the details will be obviously incredibly complicated for each specific instance.
Right, and you suggested that in discussion about the last chapter as well, that you have these choice points too that you've introduced, and you're focusing on getting a framework for the readers to be able to think about these in particular AI sort of context. In the time that we have left, let's look at how we put things together. I mean, we've talked about Lucy, we've talked about being high risk, but we don't yet have anything propositional. We need to predicate of Lucy that she's high risk. What is predication? I mean, this is a huge topic. In your book, you're focusing in particular on teleosemantics. So what's teleosemantics, and how is this going to help us put together this relationship between Lucy and the property of being high risk?
So teleosemantics is another tool in the kind of general externalist toolbox that has been considered. And the thought here is that sometimes to be able to figure out what something is representing, you need to figure out what the function of that object is. And some notions of function just look like they're human imposed functions. So, the speedometer on your car represents how fast the car is traveling. It represents that because that's the function of the speedometer. And the reason that's the function of the speedometer is because we designed it to do that and we intended it to do that. But some notions of function may be available without kind of humanly imposed function. And this is something that you'll see in a biological context most naturally. So you might think there's a good sense in which the function of the heart is to pump blood, not just because we regard it as a blood pumping tool, but because that's how it's been evolutionarily designed and feedback reinforced to function. And so, for example, in the case of perception, you might think that your perceptual states are representing the environment around you. They're giving you information about the environment because that's the function of the perceptual system, is to represent how the environment is going. And so the basic teleofunctional idea is one of the sources of meaning can be the proper function of objects. So now we're thinking this may be a profitable idea to considering how it is that an artificial intelligence system manages not just to represent specific objects and specific features, but actually to, as it were, assert and deliver us information that attributes a specific feature to a specific object. So we think, why is it when Smart Credit says Lucy is high risk, we should not just think this is a system that's represented Lucy and represented a property, but actually specifically said Lucy has that property, rather than, for example, Lucy doesn't have that property or Lucy might have that property, right? It's important that we know how it's putting these pieces together. And so another thought is, well, to answer that question, we need to, or one profitable approach is to think about what the function of the outputs of the AI system are. Right? And we think one of the reasons this is a particularly interesting case is these AI systems have features both of kind of human-imposed functionality. So in some ways, they're like the speedometer that represents what it does because we intended that it represent in that way and we designed it to represent in that way. but also some aspects of the kind of natural and say, evolutionarily and natural selection developed representational systems. So to some extent, the system has the function it does because it's engaged in a kind of feedback mechanism that's allowed it to perpetuate and develop its own internal structure in response to its environment in very much the way that we did when we were evolving in the kind of environments that we did. So we think there's a really interesting test case for trying to think how we should take this notion of function and apply it to something that sort of spans the artificial versus natural divide in a way that hopefully will produce some interesting theoretical insights into how to think about these things.
Well, there's a lot more we could talk about in the book. Of course, you go into more detail in each of the chapters than we've been able to cover in this time. And you do have a concluding chapter that develops some, you say, some sort of scattered thoughts about the extended mind theory and representation and some various things. But I think given the time, let me just close with asking if there's anything else that we haven't covered that you think is important in appreciating your book. Include the last chapter if you want, or anything that we haven't talked about so far.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of the core ideas in the book. I think if I were to, maybe this is more re-emphasizing than adding something, it's that given the way we've written the book, where it's not a particular theory that's being pushed about particular cases, and given the very high level of abstraction, and to some extent it's a sort of programmatic book trying to tell people or encourage people in our field to start thinking about various ways where they should take their favorite theories and try to do the sort of thing that we're doing. So it's a little bit of a call to arms, rather than pushing a particular theory. A lot of philosophy books and papers that we write, there are books and papers saying, we've found the truth about this, and here's the argument for why it's true, and now come and try to refute us. This book really doesn't quite have that structure. It says, here are some incredibly challenging questions, and here are some ways, and we don't even know which one is the right one yet. We're just giving you some options. But we're giving you a way of thinking about it, but we really hope to convince you that these issues are worth thinking about, and that if you spent a lot of time thinking about the nature of meaning, metasemantics, and pragmatics, and the issues that many philosophers have been thinking about, then this is a great place for you, both to improve your own theory and to apply it to a case. That's super important.
Yeah, and I'll note we'll put up a link on the podcast blog, of course, but this is an open access book, so the call to arms is very much open to everyone. We'll put up a link to the book. Let me conclude by asking, what are the two of you working on now, either together or separately? I know you co-author a lot. What's occupying you right now?
Actually, I'm going to jump in here, even though we're alternating. I'm hoping that by the end of this week, Josh will finish a new paper on these very topics. He promised me that he would do it, so I'm expecting it. And that's a very different way of thinking about it from what we've been talking about. It's a way of saying, well, maybe you just cannot de-anthropomorphize and include the AI. Maybe it's completely alien. And what do we do if AIs have a completely alien metasemantics, and they maybe even have alien contents? And so the paper or joint papers, that one paper is exploring that option, which is going a different direction, but following, I think, in the same pattern that I was just describing. Here are different ways of thinking about it. The book really sort of holds out hope that they're doing the same kind of thing as us humans in some abstract sense, but maybe it isn't like that at all. Maybe they're just completely different from us. But then we still have to try to figure out how to engage with them and how communication is possible under those circumstances. So that's one thing we're working on now.
Josh, anything to add? Would that be closing
No,
word?
so I'll be busy trying to make good on that promissory note that Herman just advanced.
All right. Well, thank you both for your time. And as I said, I'll put up a link to the book on the podcast blog, and I appreciate your time. Good to talk to you both.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for having us.